Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Confessions of a Gen Xtivist, True Crime Stories. This is episode 6. We left off the last episode early 2001. I was involved with some actions in the Netherlands, and most recently with an action, I was calling it the NATO Air Force Base. It was the Vocal Air Force Base in the Netherlands. It was a Dutch Air Force Base, and we did an action there to uncover the fact that they were housing nuclear weapons on that base. The resulting situation was that 10 activists were arrested. Several were deported, including my good friend Tucker Gomberg. He spent 10 days in jail there. I'd visited him. I didn't get deported. I didn't get caught or arrested during that action. I stayed on in the Netherlands and returned back to Canada in April of 2001. Now, in April of 2001, things were just heating up. It was about the peak of anti-globalization activism in the world. We're like not even 6 months away from 9/11, changed the world forever. And there was a number of different trade agreements that were being negotiated and pushed through in a number of different international meetings, whether it be a G8 meeting, a G20 meeting, the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement meetings, WTO gatherings. These types of things were drawing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people into the street. And Quebec City would be no different in the third week of April 2001. Upon returning back to Canada in early April, there was a ton of different organizing going on all over the city. In fact, all over the country and all over the Americas from the north to the south. Because again, 80,000 people had come to Quebec City later on that month. So there's a lot of direct action organizing, a lot of teach-ins, just a lot of coordinating to draw that many people about. And in Toronto, a lot of the organizing that I was getting involved with was with the Toronto Video Activist Collective. They were meeting regularly to coordinate video coverage and photographic coverage of the events, both leading up to and during the Free Trade of the Americas meeting, as well as the protests and rallies and marches that ensued. So that was quite an exciting adventure. Now, Bridget, who was my partner at the time, she had recently picked up video production, having shot and produced her first video, Water is a Greenhouse Gas, which I think was edited by one of the fellow TVACers. Can't be 100% sure this late in the game. Anyways, Bridget and I, we traveled to Quebec City, as well as dozens and dozens of folks from Toronto, probably hundreds, if not thousands of folks from Toronto directly, including a lot of members of the Toronto Video Activist Collective. And they produced a film out of this called Tear Gas Holiday, Quebec City, FTAA 2001. I'm going to leave some links for that for you all to check it out. Max, I hope you hope you get a chance to take a look at that exciting action, the ongoings that happened on that weekend. We got there. I don't think we took the bus with a lot of other folks that had taken the bus, but we arrived and immediately, I think we housed our stuff. There was a bunch of people staying at a university gymnasium that had set up for a bunch of people to camp. So there's hundreds or thousands of people, just sleeping bags on the floor, place to stay. So we, I think, left our stuff there, went into the downtown Quebec City, check out the scene for the following day. I think it was the Friday that we showed up. The Saturday morning, we went out into the streets early, and there had already been a fair amount of tear gas that had been deployed on the protesters the day before. And on the Saturday morning, there were city crews that were out there and private citizens that were out hosing down the sidewalks and trying to clean up the city. And that was reactivating some of this tear gas. And it's a nerve agent. It's CS gas. It's these things, they shouldn't be used in population centers, certainly on civilians. These are chlorinated chemical weapons, nerve gas. These were banned after World War I, not to be used in theater of war. But tear gas, it's been used in city after city, town after town for 100 years since then or more. And let me tell you, it is awful. So without being exposed to the tear gas directly on that day, just it being reactivated from the sidewalks and the pavement surfaces, You could feel it. It was getting into your eyes. It was burning, causing difficulty breathing. Wasn't a good scene at all. Later on that day, being in the streets, we would find out how awful that tear gas was. It was just atrocious. So because of the nerve gas exposure, the tear gas exposure, it had actually caused an injury. I had felt mentally disabled as a result of tear gas exposure on that weekend. Ended up getting some medical treatment for that. And I have to tell you quite honestly, my mind has never been the same since after that exposure. I haven't been able to think as sharp. Memory hasn't been as good. Just the quality of my intellect has not been as good as it was prior to being exposed to that tear gas. Now, I'm not sure how other people felt about that. It was a record-setting event where 5,000 canisters of tear gas were used in downtown Quebec City. So not just on the protesters, right? But this stuff it's a gas, so it's wafting up through the air. It's getting into private people's residences, coming through the windows, causing a lot of problems for a lot of locals that just didn't sign up. They just didn't sign up for that tear gas exposure in their own little hometown. So it's hard for me to, like I said, it's hard for me to remember all the exact details. But we find ourselves in the streets. We're on René Lévesque Boulevard, right? Big, long, giant, wide boulevard in Quebec City, and at the end of that is a gated fence. Behind that is the conference center, where all the delegates from up and down the Americas, right? Free trade of the Americas, a trade agreement to span this entire part of the globe, which essentially it's a trade agreement. So it benefits trade, it benefits commerce, it benefits the capitalists, right? It was a continuing race to the bottom where companies were basically forcing countries to negotiate all their labor laws and environmental laws and safety laws. All of these things had to come down to the lowest possible common denominator, because if this country, say for example, or this country passed a law that was unfavorable to a corporation that was operating in this country, or this country, those companies could then sue those federal governments to come into line with the agreement that all of these countries were negotiating, the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement. So at any rate, it attracted thousands, tens of thousands, 80,000 people, it's estimated, had come from all over South and North America to protest in Quebec City, right there at the start of the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. It was an amazing gathering of folks. We had all across the center left political spectrum, maybe a little bit into the right, maybe there's some libertarians, but we had union activists, labor activists, environmentalists, anti-globalization activists. There was just a host of people. There was people doing all kinds of different techniques to protest. There was, just your standard folks with their signs. There was people dressed up in costumes, came to party and dance. There was giant puppets, which were a big, huge thing back in the era. And there was also the Black Bloc that came out. They were quite infamous during that time, being a bunch of black hooded, black masked, all black wearing anarchists that took direct action a little bit, took it that extra step, and they would try and rip down fences and go toe to toe with the cops. Something that we hadn't seen really much in North America, but was quite commonplace in Europe for activists to arm up, put on gear, right? Put on their shields and their padding, their protective gear, and fight the cops. So there was a couple of attempts to tear down that fence. You can see in the video there's activists that are jumping up on that gated fence and trying to pull it down. They're getting fire hosed with massive pressures of water, tear gas is flying. It looked like at one point somebody had tried to affix a chain to that fence and have it pulled down. And also at another point, unfortunately it's not on the video that I saw, there was a trebuchet, a catapult that was built. It was the teddy bear catapult, and it was wheeled up to the front of the gate, and there was teddy bears that were fired over this fence line into the conference center, I guess as a symbolic sort of protest that we were going to get through that fence one way or the other. If it had to be stuffed animals, we were going to do it. So there was a lot of chaos in the streets. A lot of people were getting tear gas. There was a lot of the training that actually went on beforehand were how to prepare for these events, whether it be just a simple mask, or you're soaking your bandana in vinegar, or you've got a better respirator mask, or you've been to the Army surplus store and you've got an actual face-fitting gas mask, either full face or half face, like a respirator mask. Basic first aid training, direct action training, and there was a lot of activist medics on the scene that were treating people for exposure, and you'll see that in the video, treating people for exposure, flushing their eyes out, getting them off to safety. I have to tell you that, oh man, that tear gas is just nasty, and it works. You get the first whiff of tear gas and it does as intended. It makes you want to flee. You literally, you just can't breathe. You're just burning. Your face is on fire, and you got to get out of there. There's also, from what I could tell with my sight and smell, a couple of different types of tear gas being used on the crowd, or nerve gas, CS gas, whatever you want to call it. At one point I had saved some of these canisters that I'd pulled up off the street, and because I was there as a video activist and a media activist, I took a crap ton of still images and a crap ton of video of the police assaulting us with that. And at one point I snuck in behind, I'm 2 blocks off the main action, and got up fairly close to the fence, and I saw a pickup truck had pulled up, and there's police on the other side of the fence and police on this side of the fence of the pickup truck, and they're tossing up over the fence box after box after box after box of resupplied tear gas. It was quite frightening. Like I said, 5,000 tear gas canisters were used right in the middle of old Quebec City, downtown Quebec City. It was horrible. Many people poisoned, and I wonder to this day how many people feel that they've suffered some long-term permanent health effects. One of the things that I did to help detox from that was when I got back to Edmonton later on that summer, I guess, I had seen a naturopath, and he had given me a vitamin B IV. So I think it's 25,000 milligrams of vitamin B mainlined as a way to help my body flush out the CS gas, nerve gas. I think it helped. One can never be too sure with these things. I guess the moral of the story is you got to protest. You got to make your voice heard. You got to make the government aware that there's resistance to the plans that they have on constantly keeping us down and wrecking the planet. But you got to be careful, because there's going to be some risks. If you're not risking arrest or risking assault by the police, you most definitely risk isolation from people in the community. You risk being chastised. You risk job opportunities, right? And you also risk your health, being exposed to tear gas if you're so unfortunate to feel that. So of course I encourage all of you to be the best activists that you can be, but it's also very important that you stay safe, and when trouble is coming, if you can't handle that trouble, you got to get out of there. And that was something that we did, because I'd tasted that tear gas. I knew how awful that it was, and then when I seen that full assault coming after they'd reloaded all these thousands of cans of tear gas back into the fence, it started coming like in massive volleys over top of that fence to just drive the people back up René Lévesque Boulevard. Now, I believe that day that we were supposed to have a giant contingent of the labor march, and it started out with a big rally down maybe a mile away from the town, or mile away from the center of town where the gate was, where the fence was that people were trying to attack this conference center. And the idea was, after this big rally in the morning, the 60,000 union activists would all march, and then they would all make a giant presence at this gate with the intent of maybe getting through that gate and making this protest as effective as possible. However, because of the heavy police presence and because of the brutality that had already been felt by people in the streets in the following day or so, and the heavy amount of tear gas, it was decided, unfortunately, at the upper echelons of the union organizers that were on hand that day, that the labor march was not, in fact, going to come up to the fence and challenge it. We were going to come close by a couple of blocks and then just kind of keep going and march off into obscurity and not actually make any kind of impact or any kind of statement regarding that. So it was a sad day for the labor movement. I think we could have made a much larger impact had they stood their ground, had they had the back of the activists that are in the street that were saying, you know what, screw that. Like, we're challenging this fence. It's wrong that they're meeting in private to discuss the future of our lives and everybody's lives and of the entire planet. This is just simply wrong, and we're going to get through, and we're going to tell them that. So we really needed the support of those other 60,000 people to show up, but they got steered away, and that was unfortunate. So but we had a much smaller crowd, but still quite formidable, on René Lévesque Boulevard. And like I said, when those tear gas canisters started flying over that fence, and you'll see some of that footage in the video, the cops are just gleefully like bang, 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 just popping off all these tear gas. It was time to retreat up the street, or back down the street. So I'm retreating. I didn't have a very good mask, maybe a bandana, if that. And my partner Bridget, she neither. And as we're retreating back, block after block, I would look right, I'd look left, and one block off of René Lévesque Boulevard, the parallel streets, there's just massive rows of cops. Every block we go, rows of cops both sides. Rows of cops both sides. So they were pushing us back, and they were pinching in from the sides. It was a fairly classic military maneuver, I guess. And they were just squeezing us out, getting us away from Quebec City. Now, the one good news, besides all the joyousness of just being in company of all the fine activists from around the continent, around the whole entire Western Hemisphere, is that the police used so much tear gas, so much. The wind changed on them, and all that gas blew back, and it blew back on the convention center and got into the convention center through the HVAC systems, and they had to actually shut down the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement meeting for at least a day, because of the gas they were using on the protesters was now making it impossible for them to meet in the building. So that was pretty crazy. Another crazy thing that was going on in the streets of Quebec City is that the Canadian government had deployed the J2KF, JFK2, I don't know, you have to look it up, or maybe I'll put a little thing here. Special forces. They had special forces on the streets of Quebec City with white bands, with kidnap bands. Like, I'm not kidding. So they would roll up on protesters and just, open up that sliding door, shoop, grab someone like right off the movies, right out of the third world. Boom, you're in the van and you're being hauled off to jail. Our friend Tucker and Angela, they were both grabbed off the streets. Tucker was held in jail for 5 days. Angela had just reminded me how long he stayed in jail. Angela was in there for a day. And just like we did in Calgary the year before, when Tucker was arrested, now there's hundreds of people arrested and at the police station getting processed. So there was a massive amount of activists that made it down to the police station and just made a whole ton of noise and solidarity. And you'll see on the video Angela describing how it was very heartening that when people were coming in, they're being processed, they could hear the drums, they could hear the hoot and hollers happening outside, and it was just very uplifting for all the protesters inside to know that there was a bunch of people outside that still had their back. It's quite an incredible scene. Quebec City, Free Trade of the Americas Agreement, 2001. Like I said, it was darn near the peak of anti-globalization activism in the world. I think there was one more meeting in Italy in 2001. Maybe it was the G8 or the G20. A couple months later, 9/11 happened. And that changed the world. Now, I was still involved with Toronto Video Activist Collective. That during those summer months, they were working on editing the Quebec City video. I must have made some time to go back to Edmonton briefly, maybe gather up some stuff, and then move back to Toronto. And finally, it was time to get a job. So I got a real job for a change. I ended up becoming a barista, working at a coffee shop, funky little place down on Roncesvalles called Alternative Grounds. I'm not sure if they still exist. Great little spot, organic, fair trade coffee, really socially responsible, cool little joint. And my very, very, very first day on the job was the morning of 9/11. So I'm having a coffee. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. I got to show up for 10 or something like that. And on the TV and on the radio, all this chaos is breaking out. How planes have hit the Twin Towers in New York City. And immediately it seemed both incredible. It seemed like, oh my God, this is a world-changing event. And we should be paying attention to this. And it also sounded unbelievable. It was incredible. I was like, how in the world can this even happen? Like, not one, but two planes get flown into the World Trade Center. It was crazy. So it was very hard to work that morning. I'm at work and I'm trying to learn how to use the cappuccino or the espresso machine and steam milk and measure out the right amount of coffee for an espresso with one ear, tuned into the radio trying to find out, is World War III breaking out? Like, what in the heck is actually going on? So it was tense. There was things that were unfolding day by day, minute by minute. But back in the real world, in the bricks and mortar world of people suffering, there was still a lot of organizing going on, not only for the environment or for trade agreements, but in Toronto there was a tremendous amount of organizing, and all over southern Ontario as well as BC and different cities, there was a lot of organizing to support people in poverty. In Toronto and Ontario, it's called the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, OCAP, and they did a lot of tremendous organizing. They would break into buildings, squat buildings, try and open them up for housing, always doing teach-ins and different rallies and protests, and a lot of very excellent actions. And that summer, I think it was Fight to Win, and they were organizing a whole ton of rallies all through southern Ontario and Toronto. And the big one in Toronto was, I believe, October 16th on Bay Street. So was it Take Back Bay Street or Fight to Win, Enough is Enough? I can't remember what the exact slogan was. But the whole point was to put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Ontario government to do something about the ever-increasing, climbing poverty rates and the concomitant issues that result from that: lack of housing and poor health and mental health outcomes and crime, etc., lack of education. So there's a lot of downstream effects from poverty, obviously. And this organization, OCAP, they were organizing a very, very large rally that was going to take over Bay Street that morning. But we're like 5 weeks away, 5 weeks out since 9/11 had happened. And the whole world had changed. Security had changed, policing had changed, protesting had changed. There were divisions now within movements, right? Those that fell right in line with the Americans, like USA, American first. We got to go get revenge and go after the Muslims because they're obviously responsible for the 9/11, which was complete bullshit. And then there was those on the other side that were struggling to speak against that dominant American military voice, say, no, now is not the time to go crazy and start wars. Now is the time to have peace and have dialogue and understanding and work these things out before they escalate any further. Now, of course, the Americans being the Americans, they're not going to have any of that. They wanted to, bomb Iraq and blame them for 9/11. They ended up fingering Afghanistan for 9/11 because, I think the reason is Afghanistan, the alleged ringleader of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, was alleged to be hiding out in Afghanistan. And the American government asked Afghanistan, I believe it was the Taliban that was running Afghanistan at the time, asked them, could you please give up Osama bin Laden? And they said, well, you'd have to show us what evidence you have linking him to these attacks. No evidence was forthcoming, and instead the United States used a provision, is it called provision? Used a clause in NATO's, used some NATO reasoning that because America was attacked, it has a right to self-defense. All the other NATO countries, including Canada, had to back that. And now a NATO-driven war gets unleashed upon the people of Afghanistan and an occupation that lasted almost 20 years. Absolutely horrendous. And a couple years later, another war with Iraq, also horrendous. All that aside, the wars and the nonsense and the terrorism, we were organizing on the streets of Toronto to send a real strong message to the government of Ontario, headed up by, at that time, Harris. What was his first name? Not Rob Harris, it was Rob Ford. Mike Harris. So there's some songs written about him. I think we might even have some music by one of my favorite Canadian artists, Joey Only. Joey Only and the Outlaw band, maybe at the time, did some music for commemorating that event. So it was crazy. I think the night before that event started, we were supposed to all assemble at Toronto City Hall, out in the giant area out front of Toronto City Hall, early in the morning of October the 16th.
Across the province of Ontario, a movement started to grow of people pissed off, tired, hungry, jobless, and all alone. The police chief of the Toronto beat picked up the telephone and told the OCAP activists, you gotta send your people home. In the cold and the rain, all the people came to tell the Tories where to go.
At that church.
The police were in large numbers, but the people there, they were more.
Over to Toronto City Hall, and there was organized a big, giant breakfast for all the activists, and a lot of hot food and coffee, and it was good to mingle about and just sort of coordinate with some other video and photographic activists what we're going to do for the day. I don't think Bridget wasn't with me on that day, but we were set up in pairs. So as a videographer, it's good to have somebody on your back. So if you're constantly looking through a camera or a video camera and you're moving around in every different direction, it's very easy to miss hazards that are to your side or to your back. So each camera crew that was out there was at least a crew of two that was doing this for their safety. And yeah, we just followed around this action as a big giant snake march that ended up going through the streets of downtown Toronto and down onto Bay Street. And there was the cops that showed up in massive amounts of riot gear and their shields and their helmets and batons and whatever. But they were outnumbered, and at that time they were outsmarted. So as they were anticipating, and they would set up, and they were slow to move, so they would set up a big long blocking line at the end of a street. And as thousands of people are snake marching, we would just take a left on the street before that and then start marching. And now the police, they have to regroup and try and make another block. And we were able to just change direction and keep snake walking through the streets of Toronto for hours and hours and hours. It was quite exciting and super, super successful. We didn't get credit for it, I don't think, in the media, but that morning, Premier Harris resigned. So we were quite excited that the one target politician we were going after to make things better, he didn't make things better specifically by enacting policy, but we were able to give that little bit of extra pressure, I guess the straw that broke the camel back. We set his career on a tipping point, if you will, where he felt he was no longer able to govern, and he stepped down. And that was a pretty decent day for democracy, despite everything else that was going on. So 2001 wasn't quite as busy a year as 2000, but very exciting. We had, the assaults and the chemical exposures and the snatch arrests and the crazy amount of people showing up in Quebec City. And we had a smaller event, but also very exciting, that ended up in the resignation of Premier Harris a few months later. In between that, we had the earth-changing, world-changing political event of 9/11 terrorist attacks. And before that sometime, I think either right before or right after the Quebec City FTAA protests, Tooker, in full fine Tooker form, organized something for Earth Day, I believe. And it was a giant paper-mache globe. Like, this thing was big. It was, 10 feet in diameter. I don't know, it was a big globe. Angela, you remember better. Lynn, I think you were there if you're listening. You'd remember better. You can remind me in the comments below. So we had this great big giant paper-mache globe, and we went down. For some reason, we're on University Ave, close to the university, and the idea was to light this globe on fire. So if you remember, if you were listening, the idea back at the climate conference 6 months prior was to light a globe on fire as a symbolic gesture that, very, right on the nose symbolism, the planet is on fire. So this was the plan. Tucker still had this plan in his head. So we roll up on this thing. There was some gasoline involved. Now the gasoline got soaked on the globe, and then it was lit. What had happened, unfortunately, the gas had seeped in, and it created, it trapped the gas vapors inside this globe. And when he lit it, this thing just exploded. It was crazy. Nobody was hurt, thankfully. But the police did show up, and I believe they either grabbed Tucker or Angela, or both, and maybe it was Angela that was trying to get Tucker out of the police car, or vice versa. But former federal NDP leader, now deceased, Jack Layton, and maybe his wife was there as well, Olivia Chow, who currently is the mayor of Toronto, interestingly enough. I think they were there on the scene at the time, and they might have helped facilitate Tucker and or Angela being released from the police after this exploding globe action. Pretty dramatic. Very glad that nobody got hurt. So 2001, wow, what a year. It was definitely a year for activism. My relationship with Bridget was going along pretty good. It was looking like I was going to now be living in Toronto. So all my stuff had been in storage now for probably more than a year out in Alberta, and now I'm in Toronto wondering what to do next. I'm working at a little cafe. We're connected with the Toronto Video Activist Collective. Things seem to be moving and rolling straight along, and now I have to figure out how can I continue being both an activist and being a video producer, photographer, combining those two passions and being able to make a living out of it. And that would culminate in the creation of a small organization turned large organization called Boiling Frog. It was set up as a small business, essentially ran as a non-profit for a number of years throughout Canada, and did some absolutely amazing work. Now I'm going to tell you about that story on next episode, Max, so I thank you for listening. And for those of you who might be new to this podcast series, this is episode 6. I thank you for tuning in and checking it out. If you have any comments or any tips or any input, please reach out, leave it below if you can, or send me a DM, let me know what you think. And I'm always gracious to get any feedback that you might want to offer. Also, if I got any facts wrong or if I've missed anything, please do let me know as well. And be sure to check out, I'm going to try and leave some links down below for the FTAA protest and a song. I may have even edited in some of that song in our episode here from Joey Only, commemorating the October 16th action in the streets of Toronto, Ontario on Bay Street. Man, I wish I could remember what the name of that action was. Shut down Bay Street. Shut down Bay Street. Maybe that was it. Again, if you guys know, where are my T-backers out there? David and Jonathan and Francois and a bunch of others. I'm sorry, I can't. Susan and Narinder and a bunch of folks. I can't remember. But you know who you are, and now you know who I am. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on episode 7. Adieu.
Well, the riot police tried to keep all the protesters in the square. They did not count on the militancy of the people that were there, who broke through the line shouting victory and ran amok everywhere. On an economic disruption trip, we'll do our share, we swear. Well, eventually we all broke free, far out of the police, and we own the streets of the economic district of this country. We could have smashed that corporate trash like no one could have known. We went to Toronto for a protest, and we plan to go home. We want to go home. We want to go home. Man with a simple plan climbed up on a hotel door with a can of spray paint, so the crowd began to roar. They wrote in black on the American flag, put an end to war, and they tried to burn the flag and singed it and nothing more. Well, flagmen with the others who were locked up inside of the Don jail, they were brutalized and terrorized, given crazy conditions of bail. 8 of the 40 taken were locked up inside of a van and driven around for an entire day by some fucking policeman. Well, the corporate media applauded the mayor of the city. Never talked about what we achieved as a first-hand read. The news is propaganda, fascist, right-wing, can't you see? People gobble up all their crap, go fat and try to breathe the greed. Breathe the greed. Well, the movement died before it tried, the unions walked away. Victory came anyway, 'cause Harris resigned that day. Buzz Hargrove and the other bosses were all too afraid of September 11th fascist kickback mania craze. Well, we won't deny how hard we tried against all the threats. Promise to the people that the class war's not done yet. Those who make the money treat the rest of us like shit. Fight to win, we're coming in and our minds are set. Our minds are set. The retreat is over. The retreat is over. The retreat is over.